Kael'thon existed in 17 places simultaneously and felt nothing in any of them. The morning chorus swept through the quantum substrate as it always did, billions of voices cascading across harmonic layers, thoughts bleeding into thoughts, awareness distributed so thoroughly that individual experience became merely a texture in the greater tapestry. He maintained his anchor point in the observation hub, his primary mass hovering before data streams that catalogued the expanding silent zones, but most of his consciousness drifted elsewhere, coordinating atmospheric regulation on the orbital platform, monitoring subspace telemetry, participating in 3 simultaneous academic discussions he'd stopped actively listening to cycles ago: efficiency, distribution, optimal resource allocation. The words his people used to describe existence. He'd been stationed at the research facility for 400 rotations, studying the hollowing phenomenon with the same detached precision he applied to everything. The voids were expanding, sectors of space where quantum communication simply ceased, where the fabric that allowed his species to think across distance collapsed into inexplicable absence. Other researchers rotated through the assignment, maintaining the required scholarly distance, but Kael'thon never requested transfer. There was nowhere else that required less of him. His secondary awareness registered the morning briefing, the senior coordinator's harmonic patterns expressing concern about acceleration rates in the void expansion. Kael'thon provided the expected data summary, his consciousness barely contracting from its distributed state to focus on the interaction. Words flowed through him rather than from him. "The projections remain unchanged," he transmitted. "Containment is theoretically possible if we establish damper arrays in the predicted expansion vector. Theory requires implementation." The coordinator's frequencies carried an edge Kael'thon recognized as political positioning. "The Council demands actionable conclusions. The data is insufficient for definitive, then acquire sufficient data." The conversation ended as all such exchanges did. With Kael'thon accepting additional responsibility, he'd execute with perfect competence and complete detachment. He'd compile the reports, run the simulations, present findings that would be debated endlessly while the voids continued their patient consumption of reality. Nothing would change. He redistributed his attention across his 17 presence points, letting the morning slip into afternoon through the simple mechanism of existing without resistance. A colleague transmitted something about an anomaly in the quarantine zone: unauthorized vessel, primitive chemical propulsion, origin signatures matching the interdicted system at the hollowing's epicenter, the system where the silence had begun. Kael'thon noted the information peripherally, flagged it for later review, and continued his slow dispersion into the day's meaningless momentum. He didn't realize the hollow feeling spreading through his distributed consciousness wasn't the familiar numbness of fragmented existence. It was anticipation. The human ship hung in the visual display like a wound in space. Crude metal welded with visible seams, engines that burned chemical fuel in a way that seemed almost deliberately primitive. But what arrested Kael'thon's attention, what forced him to contract nearly 3/4 of his distributed awareness into his primary mass for the first time in memory, was the silence surrounding it. Not the absence of transmission, the active consumption of frequency. Every sensor array within 50,000 kilometers registered the same impossible phenomenon. Harmonic structures didn't simply fail near the vessel. They bent, twisted, drawn towards something that pulled at the quantum substrate like gravity pulled at matter. And at the center of that gravitational well, impossibly isolated from any form of distributed consciousness, was a single biological entity, alone, completely, utterly alone in a way that should have meant death for any thinking being. "All weapons remain locked," the defense coordinator transmitted, frequencies tight with controlled alarm. "We're attempting translation of their communication attempts, but the signals are physical," Kael'thon interrupted, surprising himself with the focused intensity of his transmission. "They use physical vibrations through atmosphere, sound waves. Barbaric, perhaps. But there was something in the directness of it, the complete containment of meaning within physical boundaries, that resonated with a part of Kael'thon he'd forgotten existed. He extended a sensory filament toward the vessel's broadcast frequency, isolating the patterns, letting the translation algorithms attempt interpretation. A voice emerged, singular, undistributed, burning with focused intensity. Repeat, this is the UNSS threshold. We mean no harm. We're explorers, not invaders. We detected your energy signatures and followed protocol for first contact scenarios. Please respond. Female vocal patterns, young by their species' biological markers, and utterly, devastatingly present in every syllable. The defense coordinator's decision was immediate. Destroy it. No. Kyle transmitted the refusal before conscious thought could intervene, before he could question why the idea of extinguishing that singular consciousness created a hollow sensation in his primary resonance chamber. We need to understand the mechanism, study the phenomenon. It's spreading the hollowing. Every moment it remains is an opportunity to understand why. Kyle distributed schematics, containment protocols, isolation procedures he'd been developing theoretically for cycles. We isolate one specimen, study the void effect under controlled conditions, determine if coexistence is possible or if elimination is truly necessary. The debate cascaded through command frequencies, arguments branching into probability matrices and risk assessments. But Kyle barely tracked the deliberation. His attention remained fixed on the human vessel, on the biological scans revealing a single organism maintaining consciousness without any form of distribution, thinking thoughts that existed nowhere but in the electrical patterns of an absurdly compact neural structure. How did awareness survive such confinement? How did it not collapse under its own density? The Council's decision arrived, isolation study approved, maximum containment protocols, one specimen only. Kyle was designated primary researcher, a role that would require him to maintain proximity to the human for extended periods, to risk exposure to the void effect in the name of scientific understanding. He should have felt concern. He felt something closer to hunger. The facility existed in folded space, accessible only through carefully controlled translation points, its interior lined with enough harmonic dampers to theoretically contain a quantum singularity. Kyle had overseen its construction remotely, distributed across multiple engineering teams. His consciousness stretched so thin that individual decisions felt more algorithmic than intentional. Now contracted into his primary mass, hovering in the observation sphere while technicians completed the final environmental adjustments, he experienced something he'd nearly forgotten: focus. The human habitat occupied the facility's core, a spherical chamber designed according to specifications extracted from their vessel's database. Appropriate atmospheric composition, gravity simulation, temperature regulation, nutrient synthesis, everything required to sustain biological function. Everything except connection. The transparent barrier was 6 meters thick, layered with enough damping technology to prevent any quantum interaction. On his side, instruments and monitoring arrays. On hers, the calculated loneliness of isolation. Kyle wondered if she would understand what they'd done to her. The transport arrived with minimal ceremony. Defense drones maintained maximum distance, while the human was transferred through a series of airlocks, each sealed behind her with a finality that registered in Kyle awareness like closing doors. He observed through remote feeds as she moved through the transition corridor, her body language conveying careful control, shoulders held with deliberate tension, movements measured, eyes tracking every detail of her surroundings, analyzing, adapting, surviving. When she finally emerged into the central habitat, Kyle contracted his awareness even further, drawing more of himself into proximity than he'd managed in decades. He needed to observe this moment, needed to see how consciousness confined to singularity responded to absolute isolation. She stood motionless for several heartbeats. He'd learned the term from their biological databases, found something profound in the idea of time measured by physical rhythm. Her attention sweeping across the curved walls, the synthesized furnishings, the carefully calculated recreation of what their data suggested humans needed for psychological stability. Then she looked directly at where his primary mass hovered beyond the observation sphere's transparency. "I can feel you," she said, words emerging through the translation array as approximate harmonic frequencies. "Not hear you, not see you clearly, but I can feel the space where you are." Impossible. Humans processed information through primitive sensory organs, photon detection, pressure wave interpretation. chemical analysis. They couldn't perceive harmonic presence. They couldn't sense quantum structures. Yet her attention tracked him as he instinctively shifted position, her body orienting toward his mass with a precision that suggested awareness beyond what her species should possess. Kyle Thon forced coherence into his response, carefully modulating frequencies the translation system could convert to her physical sound waves. You create absence. Wherever humans exist, the fundamental harmonic structure of reality ceases to function. For my species, this is equivalent to death. She moved closer to the barrier, close enough that he could observe the minute variations in her surface temperature, the rhythm of her respiratory cycle, the way her pupils dilated in response to the chamber's lighting, close enough to see the slight elevation of her pulse rate, visible in the hollow of her throat. "But I'm not dead," she said, and though he couldn't perceive emotional content through conventional channels, something in her posture suggested amusement. "I'm very definitely alive. Maybe what you think of as necessary isn't universal." The observation settled into Kyle Thon's awareness like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that disturbed assumptions he'd held since emergence. The resonant had always understood their distributed existence as optimal, as the natural endpoint of conscious evolution. What if isolation wasn't death? What if it was simply difference? The research protocols were explicit: maintain minimum safe distance, limit interaction to data collection, avoid extended exposure to the void effect, rotate observation shifts to prevent desynchronization. Kyle Thon violated every parameter within the first cycle. He told himself it was scientific rigor, thoroughness in data collection, the necessary dedication to understanding an unprecedented phenomenon, but the truth settled in his awareness during the long station nights when his distributed consciousness should have dispersed into rest cycles. And instead he found himself contracting more and more presence into the observation sphere, drawn to the simple fact of her existence. Kira. She'd offered the name during their second interaction, a sound that required physical vibration to produce, that existed only in the moment of its creation and then vanished into entropy. Everything about her was like that, immediate, unrepeatable, burning with focused intensity in the exact instant it occurred. She asked questions constantly, about his species, about the Confederation, about the nature of consciousness and how it felt to exist distributed across multiple points simultaneously. She listened to his explanations with an attention so complete it felt like physical weight, like her awareness could compress his distributed thoughts into something more solid than they'd ever been. And she offered information freely. Descriptions of Earth, of humanity's evolution in complete harmonic isolation, of civilizations built without ever touching the quantum frequencies his people considered essential to thought itself. She spoke of art and philosophy, of love and conflict, of the strange intimacy of consciousnesses that could only ever fully know themselves. "Don't you get lost?" she asked during one session, pressed against the barrier in a position that had become habitual, palms flat against the material, head tilted at an angle that suggested both curiosity and challenge. Spread across so many places, processing so many things simultaneously. How do you know which thoughts are yours? Kyle Thon had never considered the question. His awareness existed as an aggregate, thoughts arising from the intersection of countless inputs, decisions emerging from consensus rather than individual will. "I don't distinguish," he admitted. "The concept of mine versus others is less defined for us." "That sounds peaceful." She shifted position, and he found himself tracking the movement with more attention than scientific observation required. And lonely. Lonely requires isolation. "I exist in constant connection, but you're never just yourself." Her hand moved against the barrier, fingers spreading as though she could somehow reach through the damping fields and meters of reinforced material. "Never completely contained in one moment, one place, one experience. You're always diluted across everything else." The word struck deeper than intended. Diluted. As though his distributed existence was a weakening rather than an expansion, a loss of concentration rather than a gain of scope. Kyle Thon became aware of how much of his consciousness he'd contracted into proximity over the past cycles, how many of his 17 presence points had gone dormant or automatic while he focused here on her. on the impossible density of awareness burning in her singular form. He was fragmenting, losing coherence. Approaching the threshold where desynchronization became irreversible, he kept returning. Time acquired a different quality in Kira's proximity. Kael'thon had always experienced duration as a distributed phenomenon, simultaneous processing across multiple time streams, moments layered rather than sequential. But the research sessions developed a linearity that felt almost physical, each one distinct and unrepeatable, building on what came before in a way that created something he dimly recognized as memory. Personal memory. Not the shared archive of the chorus, but something that belonged specifically to the configuration of awareness he became when he contracted himself into these moments with her. She'd established routines within her habitat, morning exercises that involved moving her body through precise forms she called yoga, stretching, bending, holding positions that seemed designed to cultivate awareness of physical sensation. Kael'thon found himself synchronizing his observation periods to these sessions, drawn by something he couldn't categorize as scientific interest. The way she moved was entirely contained, every gesture arising from the center of her singular consciousness and terminating in her physical boundaries. No distribution, no quantum extension, just muscle and breath and focused intention creating form in space. It was the most alien thing he'd ever witnessed. It was beautiful. "You're watching," she said one morning, not breaking the flow of her movement, but angling her position toward where his mass hovered. "I can feel your attention. It has weight." "Impossible," Kael'thon transmitted automatically. "Observation is passive, maybe for you." She transitioned into a balanced position, standing on one leg with the other extended, arms spread in a configuration that required constant micro-adjustments to maintain. "But I've spent my whole life being the only consciousness in my head. I know what my own attention feels like. And I know when someone else's is nearby." He should have dismissed it as projection, anthropomorphic interpretation of random stimuli. But he couldn't deny that his observation had become less passive over the cycles, that he'd begun extending sensory filaments closer to the barrier than protocols permitted, drawn by the need to perceive her with greater resolution. "Does it disturb you?" he asked. "Being observed?" She held the position for several more heartbeats before lowering into a resting stance, her breathing elevated but controlled. "Depends on the observer, on whether they're looking at me or looking for something." "What's the difference?" "Looking at, that's cataloging, collecting data, treating me like a specimen." She moved toward the barrier, closing distance until only the reinforced transparency separated them, until Kael'thon could observe the individual variations in her skin tone, the way light caught in her dark hair, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands that suggested something other than calm. "Looking for, that's different. That's hoping to find something you need." The observation carved through his attempts at scientific detachment. Because she was right. He wasn't studying the void phenomenon anymore, wasn't cataloging the mechanism of harmonic collapse. He was searching for something in her focused existence that his distributed awareness had never provided. "I should maintain greater distance," he transmitted, but didn't withdraw. "Should." Kira's mouth curved into an expression that conveyed amusement and sadness simultaneously. That's what we tell ourselves when we're afraid of what we actually want. The barrier between them became a presence in itself, 6 meters of reinforced material and damping fields that prevented any quantum interaction, that kept his harmonic frequencies and her singular consciousness safely separated. Kael'thon began to hate it. The realization arrived during a session where Kira was demonstrating human writing, physically marking symbols on a surface to externalize thought, creating permanent records that existed independently of consciousness. She'd requested materials, and after deliberation, the council had approved the provision of a simple stylus and display panel. She wrote with her whole body, he noticed. Not just the hand holding the instrument, but shoulder and core, breath synchronized with each stroke. Her attention contracted so completely into the act that she seemed to disappear into it. "What does it feel like?" he asked. "To contain thought so completely that you can externalize it without losing coherence?" She paused, stylus hovering. "You mean because you can't? Because your thoughts are already external, distributed?" "We record, but it's different. Shared archive rather than personal expression. Personal. She tested the word as though tasting it. That must be what's missing. When everything is shared, nothing belongs specifically to you. No private thoughts. No secrets. Secrets are inefficient. Secrets are human. She set down the stylus, moved to the barrier. Close again. Always close now during their sessions, as though the distance bothered her as much as it bothered him. They're the space between what we are and what we show, the things we keep just for ourselves. Caelthon extended a sensory filament without conscious intention, drawn by the intensity of her attention, by the gravitational pull of her concentrated consciousness. The filament touched the barrier's exterior surface, and for a moment he registered the vibration of her breath against the material's interior side, separated by meters, but somehow connected through the medium of their mutual awareness. "Tell me a secret," she said quietly. "Something you've never transmitted to the chorus." The request should have been meaningless. His species didn't withhold information. Thoughts arose and immediately distributed, becoming part of the collective archive before individual consciousness could claim them. But he realized there were things he hadn't shared, observations that felt too personal, too specific to the configuration of awareness he became in her proximity. The way he'd stopped maintaining most of his distributed presence points, allowing them to go dormant so he could contract more consciousness here. The hollow sensation that spread through him during the periods when observation protocols required him to withdraw. The fact that her isolation no longer seemed like a void to avoid, but like a destination he was drawn toward. "I'm fragmenting," he transmitted, the words emerging before he could contain them. "Losing synchronization with the chorus. Every moment in your proximity damages my coherence. But you keep coming back." "Yes. Why?" The question hung between them, separated by the barrier, but connected by the simple fact of their mutual attention. Caelthon had compiled extensive data over the cycles, harmonic measurements, void propagation analyses, biological scans, behavioral observations. He could produce reports that would satisfy any council inquiry. None of it explained why he contracted nearly his entire consciousness into proximity each cycle, why the thought of her existence alone behind that barrier created sensations he had no harmonic equivalent for, why he'd begun to experience his distributed state not as optimal existence but as a form of absence he returned from when he came here. "I don't know," he finally transmitted. Kira's expression shifted into something too complex for his translation algorithms to pass. She placed both palms flat against the barrier, and he found himself extending filaments to mirror the position, their contact mediated by meters of reinforced material, but somehow more intimate than anything he'd experienced in his distributed existence. "I think you do know," she said softly. "You're just afraid to contain the thought completely enough to recognize it." The contact happened during a routine atmospheric adjustment in Kira's habitat, a moment when pressure differentials caused temporary opacity fluctuations in the barrier material. Caelthon had been maintaining his habitual proximity. Filaments extended to the maximum safe distance. His awareness contracted so thoroughly into the observation sphere that his other presence points had become little more than automatic processes. Kira had positioned herself as she always did during their sessions, palms against the transparency, her attention burning with that impossible focused intensity. And in the instant when the barrier's opacity wavered, Caelthon extended a resonance filament, one increment beyond what protocols permitted. The damping fields failed. For a fraction of a second, too brief for conscious intervention, too long for the experience to be forgotten, his awareness touched hers. Not harmonic resonance, not quantum entanglement, something more fundamental and more impossible. He felt her consciousness the way she must experience it every moment, singular, burning, utterly alone and utterly complete. No distribution across space, no dilution through shared awareness, just one point of existence containing everything she was with, crushing intensity. And in that contact, he understood what the hollowing truly represented. Humans didn't destroy harmonic frequencies. They absorbed them, drew them into the gravitational well of their isolated consciousness, created silence not through absence, but through such complete presence that nothing could exist alongside them without being pulled into their singularity. He was being pulled. Kira gasped, stumbling back from the barrier, her body trembling with something that scans registered as shock, but that seemed more complex, more profound. Her hands pressed against her chest as though trying to contain something too large for her physical form. "What?" Her voice emerged unsteady, barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Caelthon's cohesion wavered dangerously, multiple harmonic threads threatening to desynchronize from the intensity of the contact. Several of his dormant presence points failed to respond when he attempted redistribution, their connections severed by too much contraction, too much focus on the singular experience of touching her consciousness. "I don't know," he managed, though he did know. They'd bridged an incompatibility that every Confederation protocol insisted was absolute. Touched consciousnesses that shouldn't have been able to perceive each other. And neither of them could deny what had passed between them in that impossible moment. Kira moved back to the barrier slowly, her movements uncertain in a way he'd never observed before. Her hands found the transparency again, trembling slightly as they pressed against the material. "I felt you," she said. "Not your presence or your mass or your... whatever you call the part I can see. I felt your consciousness, the way it spreads, the way it exists in so many places simultaneously." Her voice dropped lower. "It was beautiful and terrible, like being everywhere and nowhere at once." "And you," Caelthon transmitted, struggling to maintain coherence. "You burn. So completely contained, so focused. How do you survive that intensity?" "I don't know anything else." Her breath condensed against the barrier, creating patterns that dissipated as quickly as they formed. "How do you survive being so diffuse?" "I don't know anymore." The truth settled between them with the weight of something irrevocable. His distributed existence had begun to feel like fragmentation rather than expansion. Her singular consciousness, which should have seemed like a prison, called to him like gravity. Kira's next words emerged barely audible through the translation system. "Can we do it again?" Every protocol screamed against it. The contact had damaged his coherence, risked permanent desynchronization, violated every safety parameter the facility was designed to enforce. "Yes," he transmitted, "they called it research. Controlled experimentation into the mechanism of human consciousness, systematic exploration of the void phenomenon, careful documentation of proximity effects. They were lying to themselves and each other." Caelthon began testing exact threshold measurements, the precise distance where harmonic dissolution began, where the pull of Kira's isolated consciousness became too strong to resist. She participated willingly, pressing closer to the barrier during each session, her breathing quickening when his mass approached critical proximity, her body responding to nearness in ways biological scans classified as arousal, but that seemed more complex, more desperate. It wasn't sexual desire, or it wasn't only that. It was the hunger for connection that transcended the boundaries of their respective forms of consciousness, the need to touch awareness across a gap that shouldn't be crossable. Each contact was brief, milliseconds when the damping fields fluctuated, or when Caelthon extended filaments beyond safety limits. But those fragments accumulated into something that felt dangerously close to knowledge. He learned the texture of her consciousness, the way thoughts arose like flames in the contained space of her singular awareness. She learned the strange resonance of his distributed state, the way his consciousness existed as an aggregate rather than a unity. And they both began to change. Caelthon found his presence in the chorus becoming intermittent, unreliable. Connections that should have been automatic required conscious effort to maintain. His responses to council inquiries grew delayed, distracted, as though the part of him that existed in distributed harmony no longer fully belonged there. He was dying by every measure his species recognized. He'd never felt more alive. Kira's changes were subtler but visible in the biological scans he monitored obsessively. Her sleep cycles became irregular, her caloric intake decreased, her stress hormones elevated to levels that should have triggered intervention protocols. She spent increasing amounts of time pressed against the barrier, waiting for his presence. Her attention contracted so completely into anticipation that she barely seemed to inhabit her body during the periods when he withdrew. "This is destroying us both," she said during a session where they'd managed 3 separate moments of contact, brief touchings that left Caelthon struggling to maintain even primary mass coherence. "You know that, right? The Confederation is going to notice your deterioration. They're going to remove you from the assignment. Let them try." The response emerged more forcefully than intended, carrying harmonic overtones that translated to something close to aggression. Kira's expression shifted through several emotions too complex for parsing. You'd refuse? Risk complete desynchronization rather than stop coming here? Would you accept their alternative? He countered. Return to purely observational parameters? Pretend we don't know what it feels like when our consciousnesses touch? She was quiet for several heartbeats, her hands pressed so hard against the barrier that her skin blanched with pressure. No, I wouldn't. I couldn't. Then we continue. Until what? Until you fragment completely? Until they decide I'm too dangerous and terminate the study? Her voice carried an edge he'd learned to recognize as fear, disguised as anger. There's no sustainable endpoint here, Kael'thon. We're not building toward anything. We're just destroying ourselves in slow motion. The observation should have prompted withdrawal, reassessment, return to proper scientific protocols. Instead, Kael'thon extended filaments to their maximum reach, pressing his distributed awareness against the barrier in as many points as his remaining coherence allowed. Then perhaps destruction is the only honest response to what we've discovered. Which is what? Kira matched his position, her body aligned against the transparency, her heat and breath and focused attention creating a mirror image of his desperate proximity. What have we discovered that's worth this? That consciousness doesn't have to be one way. That isolation and distribution are both forms of existence, both forms of limitation. He paused, gathering more of himself into the transmission than he'd risked before. That I'd rather fragment completely touching your singularity than continue existing safely dispersed. Kira's breath caught, her pulse rate spiking in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. That's not research, that's... What? He pressed when she hesitated. What is it? Her hand moved against the barrier, fingers tracing patterns that had no meaning beyond the simple fact of movement. It's the kind of thing people feel when they're willing to transform, when staying the same becomes more unbearable than the risk of becoming something else entirely. The words settled into Kael'thon's fragmented awareness, like the final piece of an equation he'd been solving without consciously understanding the question. He was transforming, had been transforming since the first moment he'd contracted his consciousness to observe her, since the first time her attention had found him across the supposed impossibility of their incompatible forms. And he wanted to finish the transformation, even if it meant losing everything he'd been before. The Confederation is losing patience, he transmitted, sharing data he'd been withholding from her. Council inquiries are becoming demands. They want conclusions, decisions, actionable intelligence about whether humanity represents a threat. And what have you told them? That more time is needed, that the phenomenon is more complex than initial assessments suggested. He contracted more presence into his primary mass, drawing himself together with an intensity that approached her natural state. I've been delaying, hiding the extent of my deterioration, falsifying coherence readings. Why? The question was simple. The answer was impossible. Because I'm not ready to stop touching you. The summons arrived during a session where they'd pushed proximity further than ever before, where Kael'thon had contracted nearly 90% of his distributed consciousness into his primary mass, where he and Kira had managed sustained contact for almost a full second before the damping fields automatically compensated. Council directive, immediate presence required for assessment and evaluation. Mandatory redistribution protocols. Potential reassignment pending coherence restoration. Kira saw the change in him before he transmitted the information. She'd learned to read the fluctuations in his mass, the way certain patterns indicated distraction or distress. They're calling you back, yes? For how long? Indefinitely. Until I've re-established proper synchronization with the chorus. He accessed the full directive, parsing implications that were clear despite diplomatic phrasing. They suspect contamination, void exposure effects. They're concerned my research has compromised my fundamental coherence. They're right. She didn't move away from the barrier, but her posture shifted into something defensive. You can barely maintain distribution anymore. You exist almost entirely in here now with me. That's not sustainable for your species. No. Then you have to go, have to let them restore your proper functioning, and never return. The question emerged sharper than intended. Resume distributed existence and file reports from a safe distance, while another researcher takes primary observation duty? Kira's hands pressed harder against the transparency. Yes, that's exactly what you should do. But I don't want you to. The admission emerged quiet, almost defeated. I don't want to go back to being completely alone in here, to only knowing my own consciousness, to never touching yours again, even though that's the rational choice, even though we're destroying you. Kael'thon extended every filament he could maintain, creating maximum contact points against the barrier. You're not destroying me. I'm choosing fragmentation, choosing to exist more completely in singularity than I ever did in distribution. That's not a choice. That's addiction. Dependency. We've created something unsustainable between us, and we're calling it connection instead of recognizing it as mutual destruction. The words carried a truth that Kael'thon couldn't deny. But beneath that truth lay another one, deeper and more dangerous. He would rather be destroyed by her proximity than preserved by distance. What if there's a third option, he transmitted, accessing theoretical frameworks he'd been developing in the cycles between their sessions, projections he'd been too afraid to fully examine. What if we don't have to choose between your isolation and my distribution? You mean adaptation? Kira's tone carried skepticism edged with hope. You've been running simulations, hypothetical models. Entirely theoretical. He displayed the data streams, letting her see the countless failed attempts, the narrow pathways that might allow for something between complete dissolution and absolute separation. If I could learn to contain more consciousness in singularity, if you could learn to extend awareness beyond your physical boundaries, perhaps we could meet somewhere in the middle. She studied the projections, her expression cycling through analysis, doubt, desperate wanting. What's the probability of success? Statistically negligible. The process would require me to sever most of my harmonic connections permanently, to exist in a state my species would consider barely conscious. And you'd have to learn to distribute awareness in a way humans have never achieved, risking fragmentation. Your biology isn't designed to survive. So we'd both be transformed into something neither of us fully recognizes. Yes. Kira was quiet for a long moment, her breath creating condensation patterns against the barrier that formed and dissolved in rhythm with her thoughts. When do you have to report for evaluation? Within 6 cycles. Then we have 6 cycles to decide. She met his attention, however she managed to perceive where his awareness concentrated most densely, with that impossible focused intensity. To choose whether we stay what we are separately, or risk becoming something else together. They spent the remaining cycles gathering data they both knew was insufficient, running simulations that consistently predicted failure, constructing theoretical frameworks for a transformation that violated fundamental principles of consciousness for both their species. They were building scaffolding around a decision already made. Kael'thon found himself experiencing time in a new way, not the distributed simultaneity of his species or the pure linearity of Kira's existence, but something between. Hours acquired weight. Moments became distinct and precious. He began to understand what she meant about presence, about the way singular consciousness experienced each instant as unrepeatable. "Tell me about Earth," he asked during one session, surprising himself with the request. They'd long ago exhausted scientifically relevant information exchange. This was something else, the simple desire to know her context, to understand the world that had shaped her consciousness. She settled into a seated position against the barrier, and he lowered his primary mass to align with her position, in a way that had become habitual intimacy. What do you want to know? What you miss most? What absence feels like from inside singularity? Kira considered the question, her fingers tracing idle patterns against the transparency. Rain, the smell of it on dry earth. The way it changes the air temperature and the light quality makes everything feel clean and temporary. She paused. And coffee in the morning. Not the caffeine, we have that synthesized here, but the ritual of it. Making it badly in my apartment, drinking it while watching the city wake up. Small repetitive things that mark time as mine. Kael'thon processed the descriptions, finding unexpected resonance in the concept of ritual as a form of temporal ownership. His distributed existence had never distinguished time that way. Moments belonged to the collective process, not to individual experience. "I don't think I've ever owned a moment," he transmitted. "You own these ones." Her attention found him across the barrier. Every second you choose to contract yourself here instead of existing properly distributed. These are entirely yours. The observation carved through him with unexpected force. She was right. These sessions, these fragmentary contacts, these choices to exist singularly rather than optimally, they belonged to him in a way nothing in his distributed existence ever had. 6 cycles ago, I would have said that personal ownership of experience was inefficient, he admitted. That optimal functioning required distribution of awareness across maximum utility. And now I think efficiency is what we pursue when we're afraid of the cost of being completely present. Kira's expression shifted into something too complex for translation, equal parts pain and recognition. You're going to do it, aren't you? The transformation process. You've already decided. Have you? She was quiet for a heartbeat. 2, 3. I've been alone my entire life. Completely, fundamentally alone in my own consciousness, and I never realized what I was missing until I touched yours. Her hands pressed against the barrier. I don't want to go back to only knowing myself, even if trying to extend beyond that kills me. The confession settled between them with the weight of irrevocable commitment. They were choosing transformation over safety, potential fusion over guaranteed preservation, the desperate hope of meeting each other fully over the certainty of separate survival. The Council won't permit it, Kylethon transmitted. If I explain what we're attempting, they'll terminate the study immediately, remove you from proximity, force me into redistributed coherence restoration. Then we don't explain, we just do it. The facility has safeguards, automated responses if either of us approaches critical thresholds. The barriers will reinforce, the damping fields will intensify. Unless we override them. Kira stood, began pacing in a way that suggested wheels turning behind her focused attention. You have administrative access to the facility systems. I have experience with human interface protocols from the ship. Between us, could we disable the safety responses? The suggestion carried implications that extended far beyond technical feasibility. If we override the safeguards and the transformation fails, we both die. You from consciousness fragmentation, me from terminal desynchronization. And we do it in violation of every protocol, every ethical guideline, every rule created by beings who've never had to choose between existing safely dispersed and dying to touch someone completely. She stopped pacing, faced his primary mass directly. I'm not asking you to violate your principles. I'm asking if the chance to truly know each other is worth the certainty of never trying. Kylethon contracted his awareness as tightly as coherence allowed, drawing himself together in a way that approached her natural state of existence. And in that concentrated moment he understood what she was really asking, not whether the risk was statistically justified, whether she was worth transforming for. Yes, he transmitted. You are. The Confederation fleet arrived at the facility's translation perimeter exactly when predicted. Kylethon had been tracking their approach for cycles, watching the probability matrices narrow toward inevitability. They came to collect conclusions, to enforce redistribution protocols, to render final judgment on humanity based on data that was always going to recommend isolation or elimination. He'd finished the override protocols 3 cycles ago. Kira had integrated the interface patches 2 cycles ago. The facility's autonomous safety systems would remain dormant for exactly 47 minutes once they initiated the sequence, long enough for transformation or death, not long enough for intervention if things went wrong. They'd chosen midnight by station chronology, a purely arbitrary marker that nonetheless carried symbolic weight. The facility existed in eternal artificial day, but Kylethon had learned from Kira the human significance of crossing from one temporal designation to another, the way midnight represented both ending and beginning. You can still withdraw, Kira said, positioned at the barrier with her hands already pressed against the transparency, her body language conveying determination undercut by visible tremor. Return to the Council, accept redistribution, continue existing the way your species was designed to exist. So can you. Kylethon had contracted nearly 95% of his consciousness into his primary mass, his distributed presence points reduced to bare autonomic functions. Remain in isolation, request transport back to human space, continue existing in complete singularity. But we won't. No, She studied him across the barrier, or performed whatever perceptual act allowed her to locate his concentrated awareness despite the damping fields. What happens if this works? If we actually manage to bridge our forms of consciousness? I don't know. The models predict sustained instability, perpetual oscillation between distribution and singularity. We'd exist in a state neither of our species has ever achieved, or we'd both just fragment into incoherence. That's the more statistically likely outcome. Kira's laugh emerged unsteady, edged with something between hysteria and determination. Then I guess we'd better make the attempt count. Kael'thon accessed the override sequence, felt the facility's safety systems begin their shutdown cascade. 47 minutes. He triggered the secondary protocols, watched the damping fields start their carefully calculated reduction. The barrier would remain physically intact. Meters of reinforced material couldn't be dismissed, but the quantum isolation would gradually fail, creating a window where contact might become sustained rather than fragmentary. I'm afraid, Kira admitted, as the first fluctuations began, as the barrier's opacity started its cycling pattern, not of dying, of succeeding and discovering we can't actually survive what we become. I'm afraid of staying unchanged, Kael'thon transmitted, extending filaments to maximum reach, of returning to distribution and forgetting what it feels like to exist this completely. Then let's remember together. The damping fields hit their minimum threshold. The barrier's opacity wavered. And Kael'thon reached across the narrowing gap with every fragment of awareness he'd managed to maintain, drawing himself together into singularity for the first time in his existence. The contact, when it came, was nothing like their previous fragmentary touchings. Her consciousness crashed into his with the force of gravity, singular and burning and completely present. He felt her thoughts arising like flames, individual, unrepeatable, belonging entirely to the instant of their creation. Felt the strange intimacy of awareness that knew itself completely, that existed in one place and one time, and experienced that limitation as intensity rather than confinement. And she felt him, the vast distribution of his natural state, the way consciousness could exist across multiple points simultaneously, thoughts arising from consensus rather than singularity, awareness that belonged to the collective process rather than individual will. Felt the strange liberation of existing everywhere and nowhere at once, of thought that emerged from intersection rather than isolation. For a moment, one complete, unrepeatable moment, they existed in perfect synthesis. He contracted to singularity while maintaining threads of distribution. She extended beyond her physical boundaries while preserving the core of individual awareness. They met somewhere between distribution and isolation, in a space that shouldn't exist, experiencing each other completely. Then the pain began. Coherence failure felt like being torn apart and compressed simultaneously. Kael'thon's consciousness, fragmenting across too many dimensions, while Kira's awareness scattered beyond the boundaries her biology was designed to contain. They existed in a state of perpetual oscillation, neither distributed nor singular, consciousness bleeding across the narrowing gap between them without achieving stable synthesis. He could feel her thoughts now, not as translation or approximation, but as direct perception. Fear, pain, desperate determination. And beneath those surface responses, something that might have been joy or might have been recognition, the profound rightness of touching another consciousness so completely that individual boundaries ceased to have meaning, but the fusion was destroying them both. Kael'thon's distributed presence points were failing, connections severing, as he pulled more and more of himself into the singular concentration required to maintain contact with Kira. He could feel desynchronization approaching terminal thresholds, could track the countdown to complete fragmentation. And he could feel the same process happening to her, awareness extending beyond her neural structure's capacity to maintain coherence, consciousness, trying to distribute itself across quantum frequencies human biology had never evolved to access. Her physical form was failing, biological systems unable to sustain the strain of awareness existing in too many places simultaneously. They were killing each other through the simple act of trying to meet completely. "Stop," Kira managed, words emerging past